All right, let's go ahead and get started. It's a couple minutes past the hour. Thanks for hopping on, everybody. Welcome to the Propelics webinar, What Can Mobile Technology Do for Your Sales Organization in 2018, with mobile strategist Todd Chusid. So first, I'm just going to give a brief summary of the company. Propelics creates mobile strategies and world-class apps for the enterprise. We are focused on producing internal enterprise mobile solutions for the Fortune 500. We work with clients across all industry verticals around the world, including Dubai airports, Bank of Montreal, and many more. And we have offices in San Jose, Boston, Pittsburgh, and Guadalajara. So here's a partial client list. And for client testimonials and more information on how we've specifically helped some of these clients, please check out the client section of our website at propelics.com. So Propelics provides enterprise mobile strategy services in bite-sized engagements called Kickstarts, each of which typically takes just a few weeks. Propelics Kickstarts help clients get up to speed with their enterprise mobile roadmap, with app scoping and prototyping, with mobile UI UX design, with IT strategy for mobile, with their mobile center of excellence, and with testing strategy for mobile and testing automation for mobile, and with emerging technologies in the enterprise. We also provide soup to nuts app development, testing, and support, helping clients with things like app architecture and development, the management of their MCOE, mobile app testing, and mobile app tier 2 and 3 support. Propelics also offers 3 homegrown mobile products. Audit Here is the easiest way to audit anything in your enterprise. Exact Meeting is a mobile solution for finding and booking conference rooms, and Lead to Capture offers reliable enterprise-grade lead capture and follow-up for events. Also, under research, as you'll see, the Emerging Technology Council we'll talk about in just a second, because that one gets its own slide. But for some reason, the Device Squad, the podcast that I personally produce and host, it just gets this one little mention. So not sure what the deal is there. But you know what? It's fine. I'm a professional. I can handle it. But Device Squad, let me just talk about it a little bit. It's our own enterprise mobility podcast, which I'm the host of. And Device Squad covers all aspects of enterprise mobility. We're up to about 30 episodes, all of which can be found in iTunes or in Google Play Music or SoundCloud or YouTube. Just search for Device Squad. It can also be found in our blog at propelics.com. So the Emerging Technology Council, you may have heard senior strategist Glenn Gruber on our Device Squad podcast. Well, he and Maribel Lopez of Lopez Research together run the Emerging Technology Council. And the ETC is a community of Fortune 500 tech leaders eager to share their guidance and expertise. Join the ETC today and receive personal guidance from today's top experts and exclusive access to insider intelligence and resources. Join now during our open enrollment promotion. For more info, head over to emergingtechcouncil.com. And I just want to add that the ETC has no sales angle or vendor bias. This group is all about sharing and learning and provides another avenue for Propelics to stay in touch with existing clients and to reach out to new and potential customers. So now let's begin our Our webinar for today, How Mobile Technologies Can Enable Your Sales Organization in 2018. Todd Chuse is our presenter today. Todd has a proven 15-year track record of taking end-to-end ownership and delivering diverse technologies on web, mobile, and e-commerce solutions. His mission at Propelics is to help clients reimagine, refine, and reinvigorate their business processes, systems, and data to enable more engaging and productive interactions with customers, partners, and employees through mobile devices. And lastly, I just want to say that we'll be taking questions at the end of the webinar. So if you have them, please enter them in the chat and send them to all panelists. That chat button is in the upper right corner of the WebEx app. All right, that's it. Todd, you want to take it away? I think you might be on mute, Todd.
Can you hear me, Stephen?
There we go.
Okay, my apologies, everyone. And my apologies, Stephen, for not putting out the DigiSquad call out. That was my bad. But back to the webinar. In terms of mobile sales enablement, I'd like to go through a brief introduction, kind of setting the table, so to speak. And with that, let's talk about what's needed to build a strong foundation around sales enablement. And then what we're going to do is layer on technologies, key technologies for the sales organization. And then lastly, what is our approach? What is the Propelics approach to sales enablement? And we'll take questions at the end. So I'd like to start off by saying, and really around Salesforce or Salesforce enablement, we just don't want to ignore the obvious or the elephant in the room. I think we all know that sales teams say they will support change as long as you don't get in their way, right? We also currently have a massive amount of terabytes of content that we're updating and maintaining in our CRM tools. But the sales rep still use what works for them. They may have 6 or 7 slides in their presentation, right? And lastly, we also know that there still exists a lot of paper-based processes, right? A lot of them require a significant amount of integration with multiple systems, multiple data sources, in order to fulfill that sales to order process. So the question today is, how do we enable our sales organizations with mobile technologies? I think that's why we're here today. When I thought about it a little bit more, it's not about that. I'd like to turn the question around and focus on how do we mobilize the sales tools we have today to be valuable in the moment for our sales team. And you'll hear a lot from me today around in the moment or in their event. And I think that's one of the key foundations for this discussion today. So what's needed around a strong foundation? We all talk about business drivers, whether it be around market share, customer experience. But I think really the key for us when we're seeing sales organizations be successful with mobilizing their business is really starting with one key metric. I think we all have, and I'm guilty of this myself, traditionally we have a tendency to, deliver what we think is cool on the device, or let's give them all of this, let's give them everything. We know what they want, let's push down this information to them, it should be helpful for them. And then we step back and we say to ourselves, what if we started with a mobile experience with something which can make the sales force money, something that they can easily relate to and embrace right from the beginning. And you'll hear this a lot from me, is that you do have to focus on not just business drivers, but what's going to drive the salesperson to utilize the applications that we have in the field for them and to be effective. So what we thought about doing is giving an example around what we're calling a business driver or one specific metric. And I'm going to call out Delaga London. And some of you may or may not know DLL or Delaga London is a global vendor finance company based in the Netherlands, about 30 billion in assets. They have partners with different equipment manufacturers, dealers, distribution, in over 30 countries. And at the end of the day, DLL delivers solutions to complete the asset life cycle. What I mean by that relates to including retail finance, commercial finance, used equipment. So when DLL came to us in terms of their pain points, and their pain points really focused around, it's taking me a long time to close a deal. And we poked around a little bit, and we really got to the true metric was around how many sales calls did it take to close the deal. And what was happening with DLL specifically is that it required them about the salesperson to go back 2 or 3 times. And what they were doing in those 2 to 3 times is that you got to remember is that everything is paper-based. They didn't have any kind of what-if scenarios to give them different rates on, say, a copier. And you have to remember in terms of a lease amount, dollar amount of a item in this business is really a commodity. A client will typically go with, quote unquote, the lowest price. So what was happening to DLL is that during the course of these 2 to 3 visits, because they had to go back and forth with various calculations, they had to go through different what-if scenarios with the client. Each time they had to go back, print about 5 to 10 more copies with different rate schedules so that they could sign it, then schedule a time to come back. To make a long story short, is that process was taking them over 2 to 3 visits. That was actually taking them about 2 months. And they were typically closing the deal on the 3rd call. So they would go through a couple of iterations. What we did was, focus on that process. And what we were able to do, and when we focused our efforts and we focused the applications in terms of what it needed to do in that moment and in that event to close a deal, we went from the number of days to close a deal went from 3 days or 3 visits down to 1. So now on their device, it takes them to get a quote, get an order, sign a deal, takes them 1 day. And that, as you can imagine, had a significant impact to their organization. Because remember, I go back to if the salesperson could clearly understand what the impact is that it's going to have on their business, they will definitely embrace this technology that you're offering them. The second thing around foundation, building a strong foundation, is I'm going to talk about process, and I'm going to talk about process of the day versus system of record. And classic sales tools, and I won't mention specific ones, but I'm sure you know what I mean, is that the classic sales tool or the desktop tools really prepare us for an event. Then what they do is, after they prepare us, we capture the output of that event. And then what we do is then build what I call systems of record around that. So it's specific content that they get access, specific sales information that they get access, versus building it around a process. And that's what's so exciting around mobile. Mobile gives us that opportunity to think outside the box. It's building that applications to support a salesperson's day-to-day process, very flexible. And I'm sure you've heard the term, customer 360. We're going to start, it gives us the opportunity to start building around events from a service 360, all the things that you need to service the buyers, service back to your organization, that order to fill process. The other thing that mobile really gives us an opportunity to do is think about really what they need, what they not only need at that moment, in the moment for an event, but what could be immediately shared. And then lastly, what mobile will really give us an opportunity as we're providing these applications to them, these sales enablement applications to them, really reminds us how these changes, going back to the business driver for DLL, how it's really going to help our business. And that's the key to focus on. And also, it's important not to lose sight of mobility gives us that opportunity to improve the buyer's experience as well as our client relationship. And that's what the sales organization, at the end of the day, wants to do. So let's talk a specific example around the process of the day versus system of record. And let me give you an example around an app that we created for Cintas. And Cintas, some of you may or may not know, they have about over 6,000 drivers who service about 100 million garments in the U.S. The challenge for Cintas, and again, relates to the process of the day, is that they had what was a very old application used by drivers. I'm sure we all know it. And it was also based off of, as they were going through the application, it was built on a specific data hierarchy. Again, talking about systems of record. And all that, it was difficult for that driver to, as he was driving to the store, he really couldn't navigate around that data because the data structure was based off of hierarchies. So the sales service representative was not only challenged to service the customer due to this data structure, but again, something to keep in the back of your mind is that salespeople and these drivers specifically just have 30 seconds to 2 minutes in front of their key customer during a visit. So they were spending more than 2 minutes just having the ability to navigate the data. So we coined the term for Cintas, and we've used it a lot from there, is a word, something to keep in mind, seconds count. What we mean by that is, how can we bring information and value to that sales representative to better service that customer and show the value Cintas is providing them? So this app, as I described, was really, the app was built around this structure in terms of process of the day. So think about data in this fashion, not on necessarily how it's being stored in terms of that system of record, but how can we provide that data to that SSR so he could service his business faster, provide more valuable information, and obviously ultimately increase his service footprint at each of his locations. So just trying to provide some context in terms of each of the aspects of that foundation. The third, in terms of building a strong foundation, relates to presentation, and presentation is key. And I think the common thing is that and I want to differentiate between presentation versus user interface in this regard. And I think when I talk about presentation is key, and we have a case study associated with this also, at the end of the day, salespeople are wired different. They want things that are simple, clean, easy to understand. They want supportive information, but don't necessarily need it right up front. And again, because of that presentation is key. That's going to make us think, again, in terms of what's the prioritization, in terms of what they need. It's really going to force us to think about and focus on what's important because of those smaller screens. And the way that we've worked through this around presentation is various iterations of design, navigation, and then that's when you get to the colors. But I wanted to point that out. And when we reflect on a case study, this was around presentation as key. This was around a Fortune 100 company. This was around specifically a sales enablement quoting tool. So this was an interesting process. The challenge and the relationship to UX for this client is extremely important. The sales rep was primarily driving a paper process for these quoting tools. But it worked for them, and it worked well for them, even though it was slow. But the organization of this company was that, paper contracts was being presented in front of the customer kind of like a one-size-fits-all. A lot of these customers felt that they were definitely overwhelmed. Got to remember these agreements, right? Got to remember these agreements are, the size of them in terms of number of pages is dramatic. And also it is, when you have that physical piece of information, the customer was always saying, this is a lot of information to digest, a lot of information to read. And at the end of the day, the client was pushing back and says, I'll get back to you, because what we were presenting for a quote, in terms of a paper-based application, was definitely overwhelming. So the primary objective of the applications, and there's definitely others, was to improve that agreement process. The agreement was presented specifically for building products and items for the quote. It was built around shortening that agreement. It was around having the ability to sign on the device, and going after that one of their large business drivers was shortening the sales process. And that's what this did. So although this was, you hear that it's process related, I bring up presentation as key is because the app needed to have a user experience which was soft. What I mean by that is that this application was facing the customer a lot. So the colors needed to be soft, easy to read text, right? Larger numbers. And that's the way, when we're talking about presentation is key, yes, think about it from a design perspective, but think about how the information is being presented, not just to the salespeople, but to your client, specifically around user experience. And lastly, in terms of the foundation, it is that ability to augment information in the moment. What I mean by that is, yes, you're going in, DLL as that example, with a specific lease quote in the app that you built around, but the salespeople want to know, I'll call it account insights, who is using it, what, when, but not in terms of just who my customer is. I want to have that ability to draw on information that, Joe's birthday is on June 6th. He has 3 kids. So the salesperson always want to not only have the information that they need to close the deal, but having that ability where they can tap into the application in terms of additional information or ability to augment information when they're in that event. They'll also want to have some supporting materials right there to validate that what they're doing benefits the client. They want to have that ability when we're thinking about, and not just, again, the deal, trying to show the buyer that you've thought through different options, so the ability to compare and contrast. Provide them diagnostic tools, cost calculators, demo, and lastly, real-time analytics. These are the things that, besides the actual event that you're putting in to the application, these are the things that you also have to consider and build out in terms of augmenting the salesperson in the moment. So I hope those foundational elements were good, and I think if you start thinking about those in the context that I was talking about relating to these specific case studies, you'll definitely build off of that great foundation. So what I want to go through now is that once that foundation is built, but we all talk about what are some of the key technologies that are going to help me around sales enablement. And the first one that always comes up to us is around my salespeople go into, say, remote areas. Their access, they've limited access. They need if they have limited access because of the Wi-Fi, because of their cell connection is down. I need to start thinking about how can I provide them to still do their job, but how can I start them to have offline access? So before I get to what we have seen in terms of different strategies around offline access, I like to start thinking about or put it into the right context. So the immediate thing when clients ask us about, well, I need an offline access for this application. Some questions that come to mind for us when we ask that and push back to them is that, what's the business value of investing in this offline strategy, whether you do fully offline, different strategy, different mix of strategies, online with offline support. What's that business value? Then we talk about, well, do all the data models need to be available offline? How often do those offline models need to be updated or pushed information? How are we actually going to handle if there is a conflict, meaning is that there's something, you've updated it offline, you need to synchronize that back. What's the resolution? And then lastly, of course, when we're pushing down documents, when we're pushing down sales information, a lot of the information could be sensitive. So we want to get a good understanding in terms of how sensitive that data is. So that's kind of like a brief checklist that we go through when we're talking around offline access. And you see about 6 different things from a strategy perspective. I'm not going to talk about each one of these, but I'm going to highlight a couple of which stand out to me. One is around that strategy around how do we handle conflict resolution. So there's definitely going to be, regardless of what offline strategy you select and what's most appropriate for your application, you have to be aware of those conflicts that will most likely persist, that the rules must be defined to change these types of conflicts. For what I mean by that is, if you're opting for the strategy of fully offline operational or an online with offline support approach, will usually require the user to sync their local database back to the server and pull the changes down. Another consideration is a strategy you employ to resolve any of these conflicts. What I mean by considerations or strategies around avoiding contacts is that who wins? Does the client device win if that's the latest update, or does the server always win, or the last update wins? We've seen we need answers to those questions. We also need, if they can't decide, we even have situations where the user decides, or even opt to go with a specific algorithm that we've written for clients. Probably enabling offline support for your mobile application is probably one of the most challenging phases of app development. The good news is that there is plenty of information available to formulate that best solutions. Our developers have faced this problems so many times, so you shouldn't feel that you have to reinvent the wheel, say specifically around how to handle these conflicts. But I will tell you is that you must remember to factor in additional time if you're talking about offline strategies, especially when you're talking about developing and testing the different various scenarios. Something to take away from this. The second strategy I want to talk about relates to data caching. Again, you're going to need to establish a set of requirements to define data caching rules. Caching data in the local database can be done through a lot of approaches. So many, you don't want to even consider. But at the end of the day, you want an alternative to enable faster loading of your information. So there are tools and SDKs that are out there to support client cache that you could leverage, or you can build your own. But keep in mind, in any case, you're going to still need to define what that cache expiration date. That expiration date of that caching of the data could be unique for every data modeling that you have, or even specifically at the database level. Just don't forget, when you're thinking about caching, don't forget to consider the user who logs out of your application. Should that cache persist, or should you delete it? And if it is persisting, what happens when another user logs in? So I brought up these other elements in terms of the other strategies to think about, not just when you say, I want to go offline or partial online, offline. We've seen a lot of mixed strategies associated with that, but the things that stay constant are those two things that I discussed around conflict resolution and around data caching. So I hope that helps a little bit. The second key technology that we see around sales enablement is around mobile backend as a service, or MBaaS. This has been extremely powerful technology, and some of you may or may not have already been using this. But in the past with MBaaS, the developers really lacked the bandwidth to keep up with all of the requests, fixes, enhancements that were happening. And as they were doing those features, requests, and enhancements and fixes, really there wasn't enough budget resources to rewrite the app and build and maintain this new application infrastructure. Because you're talking about user management, push notification, social integration, enterprise integration, right? So what MBaaS really does is it's excellent. It provides you reusable service catalogs that developer could use across the enterprise, across systems. So it's kind of that code once from an API perspective, but having that ability to share. The other thing that now with MBaaS is that it has been built on a secure platform. So it's really, you're really acting as those APIs are really managing, you're really managing those as a managed service. And lastly, around MBaaS, in terms of you now have the ability to integrate all the enterprise communication channels with push notifications, triggers, cross-channel connects, etc. Again, there are so many devices. When you're looking at supporting and building out these tools, there are so many different components to them. If we could standardize on one type of push notification, one type of trigger, and then being able to share that through a reusable service catalog, we've seen a development go down by at least 1 to 2/3 using this type of enabled technology for your sales organization, or really for any mobile applications. The third around key technologies focuses on the MADP, or the Mobile Application Development Platform. Here, MADP is a platform that enterprise use to design, develop, test, deploy, maintain mobile applications across multiple platforms, across multiple actors, across multiple devices. And the way MADP has helped sales, it's the concept of having the ability to write one set of core technology and being able to deploy that out to multiple platforms. This is really, the MADP platform has really helped with BYOD because there's some situations where the sales organization gets a laptop, but they have a phone that they could access maybe the application, or if you made it responsive design as an example. The MADP is really helpful for from a development perspective, because your app development is going to go a lot faster. Your total project costs are going to be a lot lower because you're going to have that single script where you can deploy that to multiple devices. And again, just wanted to share with you how technologies are improving the development lifecycle, the total cost of the project, or the total cost of ownership, as well as the user experience. And where MAD is extremely helpful for is, even though you have that one code base that is shared across devices, shared across iOS and Android, you can still design unique UI experiences for every platform. So that's a great benefit, while still maintaining that consistent business logic. So again, you're not coding for iOS only, you're not coding for Android, you're developing in an MADP platform and pushing that code and sharing that code across multiple operating systems. And when you get into, you can see the really cost benefit play into account when you have not just multiple operating systems, multiple devices, multiple versions. You continue to see things grow exponentially. And with MBAS and with MADP, just trying to share with you those technologies that you could leverage to help your mobile application development life cycles. The fourth thing that I'll talk about is regards to extensions. What I mean by extensions is we're seeing a lot right now in terms of the sales organization having the ability to do mobile printing at the time of service. Obviously being able to handle payment, not just payment electronically, but some payments. How do we handle things in terms of, what if I give you partial cash, partial payment, check? How do those things, how do you electronically or digitize that in terms of the sale? So something to think about from an extensions perspective. I talked about electronic signature, being able to sign, but then logically associate that contract, that signature with a specific context. Extensions that we're seeing is around contextual security, example being around Touch ID, proving your identity. We're seeing speech services that are out there, so be able to speech to text services, so your salesperson is out there transcribing the things, or the idea is that it's that whole voice command or voice control being able to manipulate the app with your voice, and more in a hands-free environment. So those were some of the extensions that we have seen, that we have implemented, that could extend your mobile device. And, a lot of these technologies that we're talking about, are critical for sales enablement, whether it be an offline, MBAS, MEDP, or all the extensions that I talked about. But as we know, there's a lot more emerging technologies that are out there. We're hearing about augmented, we're hearing about machine cognitive learning. And what I mean by cognitive learning, this is when we get into things such as there's large data sets that are out there. We can try to manipulate them based off of different themes and try to present them back in terms of at the time that they need them. So these are areas that are going to be investigated, are being investigated, and will come to sales. So just wanted to share with you is that a lot of those foundational things, a lot of those enabling technologies, but we also know that mobile is a journey, and a lot of this you may be doing. A lot of it is you're continuing to refine and improve, but we also know there's more to come. But that's for another webinar. So I want to talk about our approach for a successful mobile sales organization. How do we go about doing it? Two areas that I'm going to focus on today is one of our core competencies at Propelics is talking about enterprise mobile strategy. Some of you may have or may be designing or developing or have in place mobile centers of excellence. But when you're thinking about a sales enablement, sales tools, you really have to go back to this. You have to go back to what I said at the beginning. What are those business drivers? What's our competitive differentiator? Are there any, when we talked about data, we talked about indirectly, we're talking about HIPAA. So when we're talking about sales, how is HIPAA or other compliance issues come up? And then obviously we talked about a lot of these technology considerations. So device management, security, what's the architecture, what's the governance? So at the heart of everything always goes back to when we're looking at our next set of actors that we're mobile enabling, we'll always go back to our mobile strategy and look at different perspectives, different considerations, different technologies, and different business drivers. And the way that we've approached this in one of the is really a four-step process, I'll say, is that before we get into any of the business drivers or what's the opportunity out there or what could we provide, what processes that we could improve, what we do, I'll say as a value proposition or a differentiator is we call them day in the lives. So for example, with Cintas, the app that I talked about, we actually, in order to get the right experience, to come up with the right recommendations or to come up with some ideas, is that we go out and follow a driver. We're not necessarily just want to understand what they're doing, the steps that they're doing, but really we're observing how they're doing it. So what I mean by that is that when they have the app in their hand, do they have gloves? Is it sensitive that way? Looking at light, all of those things. So we're understanding that experience of, in that example, what the driver is going to, how he interacts with his client, what are the events that he's trying to accomplish at each one of those points. those are the things that are going to drive our innovation in our strategy. And once we do that, we're going to come up with, in that innovation and innovation strategy, we're probably going to come up with what we've seen before typically is around 200 to 300 ideas in terms of improving things that the sales person can utilize for their organization. And when we do that, we may come up with one app. We could come up with several apps, maybe for different events that are occurring in that sales to order fulfillment process. We then take those and kind of align them to how mature their technology is. This is where we're getting into discussion of what devices, how many devices that they need, can they support BYOD, and then actually come up with a working prototype. And that's a critical component, I'll say, because again, going back to that presentation is key. It's really important to not just take these ideas, determine what the apps are, but we can get to a point early in the process, and these are mobile enablement strategy. You're talking, this takes typically between 3 to 5 weeks. In the first 3 to 4 weeks, we'll have a working prototype that we can show a driver as an example, and really so they could start to visualize how their process is going to be changing. And then, then obviously what we're doing is taking those, what clients wants us to do is take all of those ideas, put them into a roadmap recommendation in terms of how they're phasing, and we put together very tactical action plans. So just wanted to share with you kind of our overall approach to a sales enablement strategy. And I'll leave you with these final thoughts. When we're talking about sales, can't stress enough, begin with day in the life session. Start to understand, start to experience what they're experiencing. Again, don't focus on the data that they need, the content that they need. Focus specifically what they're doing in that moment. Specifically focus on what events are they doing, and day in the life sessions really do that. I gave you a couple of examples today around business drivers. Really start with one. You could see the value that came out for DLL with their Express Finance application. Instead of making 3 sales calls over 3 months, 2 to 3 months, now they can close the deal with 1 visit. So really start with that one business driver that's really not just something that's good for the organization, but really something that the salespeople could really wrap their head around, get behind, and see the power of what you're trying to do. Third point is around designing. There's a lot of technologies, decisions that we have to make around enabling the sales organization. So design those mobile reference architectures, where if you have a strong mobile reference architecture, you'll be able to improve the scale in terms of how this grows, reduce your costs, minimize complexity, because you'll know how, as an example, authentication will work. We'll know how this fits into our mobile device management or our mobile application management. Those are the things that we'll figure out and design. We'll need to have answers to in our reference architecture as we're building out our mobile sales tools. Something that I'm sure you're all aware of, but build small, have frequent releases, limit change, because again, what I said at the beginning, sales sometimes are resistant to change, but if they see the value, if they're seeing it's improving the way that they do business, the way that they can make more money, just pull things out in small chunks, and that'll limit the change management actions that you may need to take. And then I think it's most important, and I've been out with sales organizations I've created a significant amount of sales mobile applications, and at the end of the day, and the salespeople always want to understand not just when it's in it for them, but how do we start? How does this improve of what we're deploying enhance the overall client relationship? So begin, start, design, build, and deploy. That's what I'll leave with you today. And thank you.
Thanks, Todd. Some great content there. So we just want to end with a special offer for today's webinar attendees on our Kickstarts. We're offering a 20% discount on any Propelics Kickstart contracted by December 31st. And we have a couple of questions for you, Todd.
Oh, thanks, Stephen. Happy to take them.
Okay. So first of all, we've seen number of sales calls to closure, steps to complete an order, and adoption rate of a sales app being used as metrics. But what other metrics have you seen utilized around sales?
Sure. A few things. I'll look at it from an experience perspective, and then maybe I'll look at it from more from a technical perspective. I'll come out with a couple. From a user experience perspective, it's really understanding the amount of time that they're spending in the app. So that'll tell me, like you said before, how long it's trying to take them to complete an app. It also goes towards adoption, but it's really how much are they using it as something to look for. On the back end side, from a technical side, it's important that we start tracking or understanding the key metrics around app performance. So there's a lot of tools that are out there which track latency. There are a lot of tools out there that track crashes, understand the memory. So I think you have to balance, Stephen, between that metric that is going to be good for the salesperson and the organization in terms of improving revenue, understanding what that user experience is, but then lastly, keep monitoring or keep putting metrics around how the app is performing.
Great, and one more. What are the considerations to using a BYOD program for our sales initiatives, and are there any drawbacks to BYOD?
I think we have seen, the answer is no, but I think there's a lot of things that you need to take into account when you're talking BYOD. Obviously, there's a lot of legal, acceptable use terms and conditions policies that you have to put in place. There's things, obviously, like I talked about before, in terms of how data is going to be handled. But I think if you employ some of those strategies that I talked about before, how things are going to be handled offline, how you're going to classify data in terms of its level of risk. I think those things, and then two other things that I would think about when you're talking about BYOD, and this is where things can easily grow exponentially, and we see a lot of clients run into problems with it, is not necessarily BYOD, but it's start thinking about, if you are doing a BYOD, start thinking about how many operating systems do you want to support? Do you just want to support the current iOS or current Android version and one back? Sometimes clients get into situations where they're supporting too many. So having that understanding. And then lastly, around BYOD, I would say something also to consider is the number of devices that you're going to be supporting in the field. That comes into account in terms of support, but also from a usability perspective. Maybe things look different on a tablet device. Tablet devices could come in a lot of different versions and things like that. So when you're thinking about BYOD, think about obviously the security, all things around data, but thinking about it from a support perspective too.
Great. Well, it looks like that's all the questions that we have. So, Todd, thank you so much for hosting this webinar. And thank you all for joining us today. And I hope you found this webinar helpful. Have a great day, everyone.